Okay, an easy one to get started. For some context, we'll work down the line and very quickly, starting with yourself, Deepti, perhaps you just want to do a quick intro to role and responsibilities, and I guess a top line of a couple of things on your radar at the moment with regards to spend management strategy.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm Deepti Khemka. I am part of what we call the solution consulting team at Freehand. What that means is I work with customers, understand their challenges, help contextualize how we as an organization can help solve it. Right now, a lot of what I do is helping large enterprises build out their AI strategies. A lot of them are thinking about how can we use AI to sort of build out or manage our spend more effectively, and how should we be thinking about that problem and solving for it and prioritizing it. And so I'm helping them sort of navigate that journey.
Thank you. Great. And James?
Yeah, I'm James Stricker, CPO at Wintrust Financial Corp. We're a $70 billion mid-market regional bank based here in Chicago. I'm relatively new to the organization, 4 months into the role, and really focused on standing up and building a net new procurement function from the ground up. So what we're about to discuss in terms of, the end-to-end life cycle and leveraging AI to build out an organization in lieu of, infinite headcount growth, but really, focus on optimizing the totality of our spend is top of mind for me.
Great. Thank you, Chris.
Thank you. Chris Sawchuk. I lead our global sourcing, procurement, supply management advisory practice at the Hackett Group. And in that practice, we advise hundreds of companies around the world. And one of the things that we do is a lot of research. We do a lot of research in all things supply management. So as we talk today, I will be bringing up some of the insights that we have from our research during our discussion.
Hi, I'm Birchard Allen. I'm the CPO for the U.S. House of Representatives. And in our organization, I'm going to try to kind of draw in the government perspective on what my colleagues here do in the private industry. Terms may be different, but what we do is similar to what you're doing here as well. Our organization is quite small compared to probably your organization, but we do a lot, and I hope to share a lot of that with you today.
Thank you. Right, let's get to it. Deepti, I'll start with you first because you're closest. You've drawn the short straw. I guess for some context, let's talk about the shift to agents and leveraging AI more. How has that transition from, say, co-pilots and AI as an advisor to AI agents which can execute and work for us, I guess allowed functions and systems to improve and to benefit? So across autonomously flagging maverick spend, negotiating tail spend, and things like that.
So I think the shift from co-pilots to agents, while a lot of folks think about that as a speed upgrade, right? I'm doing things faster, I'm automating more. But when you think about it from a technology perspective, it's actually an architectural shift, because the data foundation that's required for an agent to actually take over an entire process is significant. Again, if I were to sort of contrast this, traditionally, most technology has sort of collected the what and like, hey, I paid an invoice, this is how much I paid, or these are the procurement events I ran, and this is the outcome of that procurement event. Data today is not capturing the why. Why did I sort of approve that exception invoice? Why did I, approve that maverick spend that I had? Something that happened out of the ordinary. It's not capturing the why. And that's why the shift from co-pilots to agents is significant, because agents understand the context and understand the why, and so they can actually take decisions. Exceptions are no longer sort of the stopping point for agents. They can handle those exceptions as well because they've got that context, and that's fundamentally one of the things Freehand does with most of our customers. We help them fundamentally automate processes and take over the entire process.
Fantastic. James, your thoughts?
Sure. Maybe to piggyback off of what Jason Moore was just speaking about in the intake and orchestration space, when I think of S2P platforms 10 years ago, I think of relatively rigid, static, sequential workflows rather than dynamic triage and the ability to route requests to differentiated paths, the appropriate spend channel and the requisite stakeholders downstream. Now, the ability to do that and the advent of those type of platforms has enabled us to take kind of a sequential step view of the co-pilot or a singular task or an additive approach from utilizing AI to that fully autonomous, not necessarily just through the lens of tailspin management, but contract redlining, tariff analysis. You know, the number of use cases is infinite. And I think from my perspective, as I build out an organization, the value there is the ability to free up time for my people to build deeper relationships, focus on strategic and value-added work, and really move away from the administration of the past.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, I think what's interesting about the agents, and your question was, moving from co-pilots, which a lot of us utilize in our work lives, our personal lives, it's a way to get information. But as you look outside of that, the agents and what they brought is more of a semi or fully autonomous kind of environment. So one of the things that you have to think about is this agent that you place into these buying behaviors is that it has to be part of that transactional flow. The second thing is just having information, because it needs to make decisions. And so as you think about that, it needs to be connected to policies, for example, and governance, rules that you have. Even if you're thinking about tailspin, if it's going to go and negotiate in that space autonomously, it also has to have access to the common T's and C's that you utilize as an organization. So that foundation of data allows it to work in a more autonomous environment. But the key thing also, it has to know when it's outside of those bounds. And that's when it gets, people like us, professionals, involved. And it reaches out and gets the human involved and intervenes in that overall process itself.
Great. Birchard.
Yeah, I like your question, co-pilot moving away into agents. And where I am, the shiny object is still pilot right at this point in time. We haven't moved away going to agent. And, technology seems to always outpace regulations, a legislative body, which is I'm, supporting. It's really, really difficult. I would say that I've seen how agents work. We kind of play around with it in the sandbox a little bit. It's kind of breathtaking to see it work, but we're not there yet. We're still at a stage where we have a policy that defines what we use co-pilot for, which is really just for research purposes at this point in time. But we will get there, and at the same time, we will continue to research and determine how best we can utilize agents as a methodology of processing or just doing more for us, doing the thinking for us. My question is, how much are we going to have to do in regards to teaching the systems? Because co-pilots are, they do a lot on their own, but what are we going to do? How are we going to continue to teach that and maintain that control over top?
Sure. And we'll probably come on to that shortly. We've got lots to talk about when it comes to technology. What about volatility? Obviously, we probably can't get away from that over the next couple of days. A constantly fluctuating environment. How is that transforming the way departments and functions have to manage spend management effectively? Birchard, let's start with you.
Well, in terms of threats, IT security is foremost the biggest threat or defensive mechanism for our agency. U.S. House, I'll essentially say we have a target on our back, and with that comes incredible amount of security, which I can't talk about, and that's why we potentially go slower in trying to release and try new methodologies of technology. Because when there is a breach, everyone in the world is going to hear about it. So we are taking a little bit more conservative role. We want the technology, we want to use the technology, but at the same time, we're definitely in line with security for our 435 members and staff that support those members as well.
Thanks. Chris?
And I just want to refrain.
Of course.
I'm actually having a hard time hearing.
Okay.
You were asking about economic volatility.
Volatility and how it's impacting spend management strategy.
Yeah. I think, one of the things when you consider the volatility that's out there, is its impact on our processes. and in what we do as an organization. And one of the things that many of you do is our budgeting processes. And so I think, the volatility is really causing us to rethink all of that. The static budgeting, annual budgeting processes have been fine for environments that are very predictable. If I know what's happening over the next 12 months, I can put a budget together to meet the needs of what I think is going to happen. Sure. But that's not the environment we live in anymore. It's a very volatile, uncertain environment. And so the idea that we have to be much more dynamic in this environment has to be different. And so, one of the things that we have to build into that is we have to be able to bring in information on a regular basis. And this is where agents can do a very good job. They're always on, they're always working, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, 365 a year, right? So they're always on monitoring. And so we have that ability to see as these things change. When tariffs changed last year, that changed a lot of things in terms of what we're going to go do and how we think about our budgeting for the next year. We were not prepared as companies last year for that. If you look at where we are today, we are. We have that ability to do scenario modeling. So we have to build that kind of capability within our organization. So it has to be much more dynamic, in terms of our budgeting processes and agents, that are working on an ongoing basis to allow us to know what that is happening. We can build that into the process.
Thank you. James, how are you reacting at Wintrust?
Yeah, I mean, to be honest, in the banking space, volatility is a factor of everyday life. So it's not necessarily anything new. And we're not necessarily in the business of buying physical commodities or things that are largely subject to tariff changes in the short term. But that said, I think kind of echoing what Richard alluded to, where the volatility has a more outspoken impact in my space is the third-party risk space, be it geopolitical allies or labor arbitrage or the number of security risks that posed by virtue of that movement on a periodic basis. And that's where we're bringing in the always-on agent presence to give us kind of a view of where our risk exposure is on a daily basis.
Okay, Deepti?
Agents can sense everything and anything. I think you guys talked about it quite a bit. I'll also add the element that we hear from customers is, hey, but my data is not in a standard format, right? I've got benchmarks that are coming in from different providers. I've got, Excels that I guess I use for budgeting and forecasting. I've got strategy documents that have been built out that my procurement teams have set up. And, what we sort of walk them through is agents have sort of changed what is possible. It's no longer about just sensing the data, but also being able to ingest data in different formats. It doesn't matter if it's a document, it doesn't matter if it's a flat file, it doesn't matter if it's a system. The agents can actually sort of ingest that data in any format, sense, and then pivot. At minimum, most of our customers sort of start with, can the agent ingest these different formats of data and make recommendations that, hey, something has changed. My benchmark or my spot rates have increased, or there has been a significant, demand increase in this particular category, and they can at least alert you to it. The goal that most of our customers are trying to get to is how do we have the agent sense and actually take action as well so that procurement teams or spend management teams can focus on more strategic aspects.
Yeah, and I want to make one other point on that is that, as you think about this sense and respond capability that you're talking about, it is that sensing, but it's not just a reaction, right? What you want to do is start to have these agents be able to sense further upstream things that are happening. A lot of times there are things that are going to happen, but we have no visibility to that. It's further upstream. Eventually it'll get to us, and then we're reacting. So the idea, as you mentioned, is we can give the agents more access to this information. So we have to give it information. If it doesn't have access to it, it can't help us understand some of these predictors that may be a predictor of a disruption that is forthcoming. So.
Sure, and I guess we're kind of segueing into the point that comes next about bringing that data together and complexity or the opportunities there. Chris, if you don't mind, I'll stay with you as you picked up on the theme. I mean, how can companies effectively kind of bridge the gap between modern tools and I guess their old school kind of legacy systems to get that kind of single clean view of where every dollar's going and where the business is going?
Yeah, I mean, when you think about the technologies that are out there, I have a perspective that, and I know Zip was up here before talking about orchestration. It's not replacing, it's orchestrating. You can stay with a lot of the platforms that you have. And so as long as you have that data connected, either you can decide to centralize it or you have it connected and you have a graph database that you create across all of these various systems, and then it's orchestrated. That's how you're going to be able to sort of bring this world that's fragmented together. So it's going to be very dependent on that connectedness that's going to be allowed through the orchestration platforms, as well as having that foundation of data. But we're also going to be putting other things in there. We were just talking about agents. They will be in that environment as well. But they need to have a traffic cop to understand where are they going to go find that. And so that's really where you're going to do. If you have that centralized view, then you're going to sort of have that roadmap of where all of this data is. And that gives you the auditability, in the company if somebody, wants to go back to you and say, where did this come? Do you have that virtual path of what happened? How were approval decisions made, et cetera?
Okay, anyone else want to pick up on that?
I think when data today is sort of, when you talk about data, people think about data in an ERP or systems. They're not fundamentally thinking of things like Slack messages or Teams or emails. And a lot of context and data actually sits in all of this. And I think that's the other thing that agents unlock. They're not just referencing. We have built this concept called a context graph that's not only capturing the what happened, but also why it happened, right? Why did something get approved? And the fact is that that data does not sit in your ERP system or your systems of record. It's sitting in someone's email. It's sitting in a text message or a Slack message or a Teams message that a manager sent out to the CEO. And so that data also needs to be considered. And that's something that most of our customers are sort of working towards. How do we actually get that data as well? Because that tells you why things happen and truly sort of move from Copilot to automation.
James?
I mean, to reiterate kind of what Chris alluded to, in the financial services space in particular, the proliferation of stakeholders from intake to pay has exploded, right? And that's really disrupted our traditional S2P life cycle because those traditional suites weren't built to accommodate the flow of information between 20, 25 internal stakeholders and the bevy of organic underlying systems that each of those functions utilize. And from a procurement perspective, for me to come in and suggest that I'm going to rip and replace with a singular solution that 20 disparate stakeholders throughout the organization are now forced to utilize is a difficult sell. So the orchestration layer really enables people to stay within their source systems, collect data once, and move it seamlessly system to system as necessary to create that full intake to pay, auditability, and life cycle.
Thank you.
Yeah, and we're still moving in that direction. ERP is our system of choice right now until we are able to nail down a policy that moves us forward into the agent world and move data in a completely different way.
Thanks. I mean, technology aside for a moment, what about, I guess this is a transformation journey, behavioral change, compliance, actually, I suppose, getting the organization to leverage all of these tools. With something like Maverick Spend, for example, how do you change employee behavior? There's an employee behavior and cultural piece as well.
One way we do it, Maverick Spend on the government side is called unauthorized commitments. 31 U.S.C. prohibits federal employees from spending money not appropriated by Congress. So Maverick Spend on the private side, I'm not really sure, other than slaps on the hand that you might get for spending off contract. Spending off contract on the government side does have some penalties to it. And we don't see a lot of that today as we used to. At one point in time, if there was a Maverick Spend or unauthorized commitment, that employee would actually have to pay for that transaction. Mm-hmm. And that would really curtail that in the future. But today, we don't see that as often as it was 10, 15, 20 years ago.
Okay, Chris, what are your thoughts on that? Is there a cultural piece as organizations transform?
Yeah. You know, when you think about maverick spend, and, you know, I mentioned I would bring in some insights from our research. The first thing to understand is maverick spend still an issue. And it is. And why is that? I mean, we put in guided buying channels within our organizations, but you still find people going outside of, you know, to different suppliers and what's preferred, you know, doing things that are not necessarily in line. And I would argue that one of the reasons we do that is just because of speed. You know, we're in an environment where the business cadence is moving and accelerating faster and faster. And so some of the tools that we have today don't allow for that dynamic and just high velocity environment that we have as organizations. So with that, you're starting to see this behavior around maverick spend. I don't have time to wait. I'm going to go and do something my own way. And so the question then becomes is, how do you deal with that? How do you deal with maverick spend? Because it is occurring still today. We see that in organizations. And the thing is, you have to change behavior. What we don't want is procurement to be the policy police, right? But what we want to do is create awareness around that. I used to say that, you know, it's sort of like, you know, we all drive cars. And, you know, one of the things when you're driving down is you have speed limits, right? And I would give the analogy, as I said, at first, you have to have some kind of policy, right? So there has to be a rule, a law. So we, you know, in governments put a law in place. I live in Florida, and so on the highways, it's like 75 miles per hour. Well, then the second thing you have to do is you have to create awareness around it, right? If you don't know what the speed limit is, even though it's a regulation or a policy within your company, nobody's going to adhere to it. So what do? You have signs as you're going down. It says, hey, it's 75 miles per hour. Now, some of us will see that sign and we're going to go faster anyway. We're going to go 95. And so then you have to enforce it, right? You have to enforce it. And so we have police officers, you can get tickets, all those types of things. So we have to apply that same thing within our environments. I think one of the things that's changing is that there's technology out there that is trying to be more predictive. Not to wait till you do a maverick buy and say, shame on you, you need to go and do it this way. But you have companies out there, technology, that we're looking through emails and we're starting to sense the behavior, somebody getting ready to make a technology buy because we're monitoring the chatter in emails, and we're getting that in procurement, and we can go out to those stakeholders and say, I think, you know, I understand you're looking at this. They're going to say, well, how do you know that, right? That's been like, but they're starting to monitor this within organizations. Well, now we're getting predictive, and that is going to allow us to really curb some of this maverick spend that is occurring.
Great. James?
Yeah, I think twofold. I think one, what Chris alluded to in making a compliant process as seamless and frictionless as the non-compliant path, which people view as the path of least resistance. So I think building an intuitive guided buying experience that's right sized based on the risk and the size and exposure of the spend request leads the horse to water. But number two, I think shedding light on the value proposition that they're leaving on the table by virtue of their non-compliant spend, right? If I can go to a business leader and say, you're overspending $2 million a year by virtue of your rogue buyer's behavior, that's eye-opening for them, and a carrot rather than a stick in terms of getting them to the compliant path.
Thank you. Deepti?
No, I mean, as a technology provider, we don't look at this as a compliance problem, rather a user experience problem, right? How do we make this seamless for the user to be able to, well, maverickly buy? And I think the answer to that is sort of mimicking what they do today. Again, traditionally, technology has always had an interface. There's a portal, you log into it, you submit a request, fill in a really long form, submit a request, and then wait for approvals to come through. And that process can take 6 weeks. And that's why people sort of go outside of that path and say, hey, I'm just going to email the vendor because I know them and I've been working with them for ages. Now, the way we think about this as a technology provider is, how do we actually, let's take that same process that they have, which is sending an email. And can we actually retain that process? They don't have to change their behavior. We just embed agents into that process. So a very sort of simple example of that is copying a mailbox, procurement at freehand.com, and the agent is basically then going to guide you to it, helping the user sort of, if the user is looking for data, if the user is looking for insights, they've got a 40-page contract, they need to read through that and make sure that it's compliant to their business and it's not violating any policies. The agent sort of speeds up that process. So the way we think about this is, can we help the user sort of get something out of it? And can we make it frictionless? And I think a lot of that actually has to do with making technology or like having AI agents exist in the background without actually having someone log into a portal and like fill out a form.
Great, thank you. I guess with compliance comes regulation almost. Obviously, requirements for transparency are increasing all of the time. How can functions and procurement professionals best leverage tools like AI and the data they have available to make sure their spend is transparent, that they're meeting the regulations and so on? Deepti, I'll start with you and then we'll work back down the line.
I go back to the point about data. I think data has traditionally been collected in what is called a data lake. Those have existed for eons. The question, and that's going to continue to exist. That's not going away. But I think from a compliance standpoint, you actually need sort of, let's take financial audits, right? You've got invoices that come in, those need to be audited, they need to be SOX compliant, they need to have sort of regulations depending on which geography you're operating in. Traditionally, again, it has required a bunch of analysts to sit down, collect, export data from an ERP or some sort of platform, and then pull together reports. With sort of the shift into context graphs, we see, those audit trails being maintained. So it's, whether you're talking about 15 audit markers or 25 or 3,500 audit markers, the agents, again, as you said, don't sleep. They work 24/7. So they're able to sort of maintain those audit markers and then maintain those logs, as well as the relational sort of connection. Why this invoice did not match the contract, but it was approved because there was a conversation between the procurement manager and the vendor. And, there was a war going on. And so it was approved.
Yeah.
All of that revelational context.
I would agree. Compliance probably is the biggest bang for the buck, especially if you have an IG that, routinely or biannual takes a look at your records and sees how well you're doing. Compliance, it's definitely a plus to have. I think agents, what I would consider more concerning is financial transactions future. Using agents, that requires a lot of thought and careful thinking before that's actually implemented. And I'll leave it at that.
Okay, thanks. James, do you want to pick up?
Yeah, I think where we're finding applicability is, none of these underlying source systems, purchase order ERPs, capture the full gambit of data sets required by virtue of a number of different regulatory expectations. And so we find our stakeholders doing kind of a post-mortem scramble to cobble together data sets for various purposes or reporting obligations. Where the agents come into play is at intake once again, to really delineate between the use cases that require those value-added attributes versus those that don't, rather than taking a one-size-fits-all approach. And then where the applicability analysis indicates these X, Y, and Z attributes are now required, we're collecting them at the point of supplier onboarding and then organically, again, flowing them downstream into their home source systems. So we're trying to take a right-sized approach and collect data on an as-needed basis rather than cast the widest net and try to collect all those attributes, largely unnecessarily in some cases.
Chris?
Yeah. I'm probably going to look at it from the perspective of just the data itself. And, one of the things that we've shared up here is that for agents to work well, for AI to work well, we need data. And so you have to look at your data as a critical competitive advantage for the organization, not just access to it, but you have to look at the characteristics of that data. One of the lenses that is pretty common out there is the 4 V's. V is in Victor. And so you have volume. So you have to look at your data and say, how much volume of data do I have, right? Number 2 is the velocity of that data. like food, data gets stale over time if you don't act on it quickly enough. So if I have it, do I have the internal capabilities to act on that data, whatever we're finding? It's the veracity of that data, the accuracy, but it's also the variety of that data, knowing that data continues to grow. We've talked about big data for a long time, and it just continues to grow. And when you look at the veracity of data, you start looking at, I have internal sources of data. There are external sources of data. What's happening in the supply markets? How am I ingesting that in and bringing all of this together that these agents that we've been talking about can operate on that? So that becomes very critical. And so as you look at, you're trying to create this transparency, it gets very difficult. This is a massive, to me, it's one of the biggest challenges that we have in supply management, because if you look at the depth, right, we have to look at multiple tiers within our supply chains. And when you look at those multiple tiers, there's data from every single one of those nodes in the tiers and all the suppliers that are out there. That's a massive data issue. And I would say the last thing about it, it's not static, it's dynamic. Sure. Companies that are third tier up in our supply chains may decide to change the supplier out. Well, that changes the dynamics potentially, and you as that customer further down in the supply chain don't even know that's occurring. So not only is it a visibility issue, it's a massive data issue, it's also a dynamic issue that we have to deal with.
So how do you manage that? How do you mitigate that increasing complexity? Obviously, you've probably got time to go through the whole strategy, but what are the key steps to take to I guess, take hold of that data and move forward as you're talking about?
Well, you have to, have decisions in terms of what data is important to you. And, I talk about some of the characteristics of data, but as you're sitting there, one of the things that organizations want to know potentially is, early risk predictors. We sit there and we say, well, what risks do you have in your supply network? That's a very difficult question for most companies to answer. We know that because we don't have to go back too far to the pandemic, and we learned very quickly that most companies did not have that upstream visibility beyond tier one, and there were a lot of things that occurred, and we had a lack of visibility, a lack of transparency, a lack of data and insight. So, how do you fix that? Well, you have to pull all of that together, but you have to have objectives. What are you trying to solve for as you look through that area? In some companies, it's around third-party risk management. And so if that's the case, what information do I need to have? Are you trying to protect? Are you trying to get information around, financial solvency, risk factors there? Are you trying to get information about sustainability, in those different tiers? Are you trying to get insights in terms of the carbonation based on, some of the regulations in Europe especially? There's a massive amount. But the first thing is you have to have your objectives in terms of what are we trying to gain visibility to, more real time, and then be able to act on that.
And the risk from the government side is really performance.
Yeah.
I mean, data, we want good data. I can sit into a room, you can have 3 people in here, and we'll argue, my data's right. No, your data's right. No, your data's right. But at the end of the day, it's the contractor performance is really the risk for me, because it's hard to explain spending a few $1 million on a project and then not being completed all right. And I've got oversight telling me what happened. That is my biggest risk. That today still is my biggest risk. It's not really the data to the degree that, we have an issue with agents or we have, road financial information going back and forth. It's really just the performance of the contractor. And we try to mitigate all the time what that risk is, because once it gets breached, once you have an issue, then it's all hell to pay.
Oh, I can imagine. James, where are you on that data journey, and what's your take on that subject?
A lot of the data attributes pertinent to a financial institution are Fiscal. And so one, it is knowing which are kind of regulatory driven, your must-haves versus your nice-to-haves, and then kind of finding a means to periodically refresh and keep current those must-haves, right?
Deepti, Freehand's perspective on managing data and leveraging data.
Yeah, no, I think that, for anyone sitting here that is evaluating an AI solution for anything regarding spend, I would encourage you to ask that AI provider how they work with bad data. A lot of AI solutions out there, give them good data, they can make the best decisions, they can give you the best outcomes. But the reality is, like most data out there, every organization, no matter how tech savvy it is, has bad data. And I think it boils down to a couple of different things. One is, that feedback loop. I think you talked about it, where, based on how you're sourcing, you should be, paying out invoices or paying those vendors based on that contract. And then that contract needs to feed back into how you source. And just if that loop sort of breaks down, just building off the example that you gave, right? They swapped a couple of digits, 6 and 5 got inverted, and I ended up paying my vendor a lot more than I wanted to. And so that can essentially, automations like that for audit have existed, and AI teams can essentially manage that a lot more effectively, because a human would sort of look over that and just see 6-5 and say, hey, that works. The second aspect I would say is more around, being able to sort of differentiate between bad data and anomalies. A lot of the times, most of our clients sort of think of anomalies as bad data, but that's not the reality. Again, it boils down to that context graph that I was talking about, where if the agents form those relations and understand why that spend happened or why was this contract sort of signed out of the normal compliance, it essentially helps you sort of differentiate between bad data and, true anomalies.
A final question. We can keep it tight on this one. Down the line, what's your take on the single biggest risk to corporate spend over the next 5 years? Birchard, we'll start with you.
Corporate spend?
Yeah.
We're flat. We're not, we've been flat for about 3 fiscal years. I don't see us, corporate spend for us is what our budget looks like. And it's been flat. I don't see it increasing that much over the next 5 years. But who knows? Things do change. And I'm hopeful that if there is an increase in spend, we can continue to test and perhaps purchase some of the newer technologies that are out there, like agents, and put those into actual practice.
Fantastic. Chris, thank you.
Well, if you're asking about the biggest non-technology risk, I would say it's VUCA. Volatility, uncertainty, complexity, and ambiguity. That's the world we're living in today. And what does that include? Well, one, it includes deglobalization, right? We're looking at a world that we're starting to look at more regional development. We're looking at conflicts in different geos around the world. We're looking at election cycles, tariffs, regulatory issues. That is a very dynamic environment, and that's been going on, these disruptions, since pre-pandemic. And so as I tell organizations, if it's a risk, in our spending, it has to be those. But the thing that you now have to do is, what is the antidote to that? If the volatility is out there and the uncertainty, then what do we have to go do? And so what you're seeing organizations doing is, in some cases coming out of the pandemic, we were looking at dual sources of supply. We were moving it. And this is raising costs within our supply chains at the same time. And so when you look at that, one of the effects of this volatility, because if you have a volatile world, the antidote to that is I have to be more agile as an organization. And it's not just my ability to react when something happens, it's also to have that predictive capability to do something ahead of time and mitigate some of this. But to do that in some of these mitigation factors, it is increasing the cost within our supply chains. We all feel it. We're buying, we're going to the grocery store, we see that today. So, these are the types of things. And so we're having to balance risk and cost in many cases. To me, that's the biggest issue and biggest risk to our spend management outside of technology.
Thank you. James.
Yeah, I would totally agree. I think the geopolitical climate is most certainly, aside from technology, the biggest elephant in the room for us, right? Like, having spent a number of years in a Canadian financial services institution, obviously the global trade environment put a huge strain in the U.S.-Canadian relationship, causing our organization to totally rethink and really take a local, regional purchasing viewpoint. And so being able to react, understand, the geographies in which your supplier spend is located, having, what is the alternative if it look like? And then obviously from the technology side, having been in an environment where we're, realizing labor arbitrage for the past 3 decades, really pivoting heavily into a more technology-driven arbitrage strategy where, the AI chase for value realization, it's far surpassing any of that. Labor arbitrage is also, a significant risk to how we've viewed spend historically.
Piggybacking off of James is, geopolitics, of course. But I think the impact of that is the labor market fragmentation. So when things are uncertain, you sort of fall back to, that person on the procurement team that's been part of your team for the last 30 years, because they've got the context. They know exactly which vendors are preferred, which ones are going to stick by you through all of that uncertainty. The problem happens when they sort of retire or decide to leave. And that context, that relationship, the knowledge base that they've built over time just sort of leaves with them. I think that's a big risk that most companies are sort of not thinking about in the forefront.
Okay, thank you so much. I think, look, we're tight for time, but we might have time for 1 or 2 questions. Does anyone have any questions in the audience for any of our panel? Yes, at the front here. Do we have a mic? Just bear with us a moment. Thank you. Just down the front here. Yep.
Hi, my name is Anna Labatina. I work with much smaller vendors than you do. My question is more general, especially when it comes to scope 3, because I'm sure, as you're aware, there's a lot of...
We need the volume up on there. Sorry, not to talk over you. We can't hear the question very well. Yeah.
Scope 3 ends up being very expensive for a lot of companies, especially the larger you are. So my question would be, a lot of organizations talk about supplier collaboration and sustainability. In your experience, what separates corporations that do it quite well from those that do not?
And I'm going to try to rephrase because I caught probably every other word. And you were talking about, scope 3 and, collaboration within the supply chain. And what you're saying is what makes the difference? I couldn't hear what you just said. Sorry.
Are you talking about what? Sorry, were you asking what makes the difference?
Okay. I think we've talked about a number of the different things, and I think one is that transparency. One is you have to have all that data, and that's where one of the challenges are. As you talk about scope 3, we're looking way out in the extended supply chain. That's challenging today. And so there's certainly outfits out there that are trying to bring more transparency into multiple tiers when it comes to, the broad-based sustainability, whether it be ethics, whether it be, some of the environmental issues, et cetera. Now, I think the other thing is that, I don't think it's all reliant on technology. One of the things that we learned, we did some research coming out of COVID. And one of the things that we saw that was a differentiator for those organizations that were successful in working with their suppliers through COVID, and this is just a situation, because one of the things, we were on allocation of supply for a lot of organizations. And what was one of the biggest differentiators were the relationships that companies had with their suppliers, and how they were treated during that period of time made a big difference as to whether or not they were getting supply. So,
and if I could just piggyback,
yeah,
adaptability is an attribute for suppliers that we look at. How quickly can you adapt when situations change? And that can bring forth really positive outcomes. So I would look at that as well as their management approach. How do they approach a project? How do they plan to manage the project? Those two things are telltale signs for any good company, whether or not in their past experience they're going to be successful in the future.